But in our society today, where we never have time to stop, the word compassion is in danger of sounding a little anachronistic. It's time for us to recover and restore it to its original dignity. In opening our heart to compassion, and just Michael gave me a list of all the extraordinary activities that you have been involved in. So well done, because that's an extraordinary act of compassion with an open and enlarged heart. But it's not a choice everyone makes. And that's very sad, because actually we are made for compassion. And the events in Sydney and all sorts of other places in the last few days just says how vulnerable each person is. And our society, there's some darker clouds than there should be. What's the answer? Compassion. It's a very simple answer, and yet it's so profound. Pope Francis says, open your hearts to compassion. Often we think it starts with us. One of the things about faith is we experience God's compassion. We often think we're the agents, or the first agents of it, when in fact we're the second agent. We actually have to feel the compassion of God for ourselves. We live in what they call these days the whatever generation. It's not as if people are against faith, it's that they're indifferent to it. And that's a really hard thing to do. It's, whatever. You can actually struggle against or talk with someone who's got a very different opinion. But when there's an indifference, it's hard. So that's the kind of society we often live in these days. Francis is trying to respond to that. What do we need in our world? More compassion. And if you look at all of what he's trying to say to the church, and there's a little bit of a mistranslation in some of the scriptures that says, be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect. Well, I look in the mirror every morning and see that that's not the case. But actually the better translation is, be compassionate as your heavenly Father is compassionate. Because this is a way in which we can serve the world, love God, love our neighbour, love ourselves, but with that compassionate heart. It's not a weakness, it's actually a great strength. It's very simple. And you do it all the time. Well done. Giving back saves us from indifference. Again, looking through that great catalogue and graphic bars, or whatever they call them, of the extraordinary activities, you're doing it already. But sometimes it's good to ground it in, well, why are we doing what we're doing? Why might we be different from another organisation? It's because it's why we do what we do. Not just the how, and you're doing that very well, but also grounding it in that, because giving back saves us from indifference. So we've got to fight against a certain indifferentism. Well, it's not my problem. And we see heroic experiences of that. So I guess my thing is really, we want to look about compassion in action. Maybe your next meeting, Michael, you could begin a little reflection on chapter 2 of Fratelli Tutti, because it helps to inform why we do what we do. Not that we've ever forgotten that, I don't think that, because you're doing it wonderfully, but it just helps to give that we're not alone in this. It's actually something we do with the grace of God. Sometimes we forget that. But it's actually God's grace at work in us. Compassion comes to us before we are compassionate. But it makes the difference. It makes our actions not transactional, but relational. But I wanted to give you something for formation. And I think the whole image of the Good Samaritan is a great place to start. And I think Francis gives us a wonderful insight of what compassion is about. And you're expressing it in so many ways, but it helps us to understand, well, it's not just what we do, it's what we do with the grace of God and God's help. And actually, God has been compassionate to me first. And sometimes we don't even recognise that. But when we stop and think, you know what? I have received the compassion of God. It sort of puts things around the other way. See, like the paintings. We think we're doing it all, and then we're starting in the wrong place. But if we start with the fact that God is compassionate to us, then it turns around, and then there's a greater sense of giving shape and form to all of our different projects that we do. Because we begin to understand why we do what we do and why it's different from any other organisation. Not only the motivation, but also this thing called grace. That was one of the Pope's inclusive desires, to make sure the voice of the young was heard. And on our table, one of the young persons said, "What would I dream the church to be?" And she put it in a beautiful way: an usher, not a bouncer. But it was her impression that sometimes the church came across as a bouncer. You're not coming in unless you. I said, what our generation looks for are ushers. It's an extraordinary little insight, just in a couple of words, about the deep desire in to belong, to be heard, yes, but not the only voice. It was a very stereophonic experience. So I thought that was an extraordinary little insight about what the church could be, but how it's often perceived. We're always telling people what we're against, but not always what we're for. It's not about the business. In the first instance, it's about the people. It's about rekindling the experience of hope. But to me, it's a striking image, because we live in a very image-conscious time. So it's not just words. So my simple message is compassion. For you as a formational element, helping us understand why we do what we do, a great place to start is the parable of the Good Samaritan. Because that actually helps and informs us. First of all, compassion comes to us, but second, we are to be compassionate, and all that litany of things you've done are expressions of that. I'm not here to say you're not doing anything, you are. But let's do it with that deeper sense of purpose about why we do it, and well done. Fratelli Tutti is simply available on the internet anywhere. You can buy copies from St. Paul's, but if you're going to start somewhere, start with chapter 2. An extended meditation on the Good Samaritans, and we've all experienced what a Good Samaritan is. We can be the Samaritan, the innkeeper. Sometimes we might feel like the bloke in the ditch, but we try not to be the people of indifference who simply walk on by. Thank you very much.